This episode of AvTalk was first released as a video episode on our AvTalk Podcast YouTube channel. For the visual version of the episode, click the link in the show notes or search AvTalk Podcast on YouTube. All of the visuals included in the video can be found on the Flight Radar 24 blog pages for the respective accidents linked in the show notes. Hello and welcome to a special episode 301 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick here, as always, with
Jason Rabinowitz, both in audio and this week in video, which usually means we have some unfortunate news to talk about.
Yes, this week we are putting together a special video episode of the podcast and a special episode of the podcast. We were supposed to be off this week, but due to the events both in Kazakhstan and South Korea, we felt it was worthwhile to put something together for this week, and something that includes a lot of visuals this week to help explain what we know so far about the crash of Azerbaijan Airlines 8243 and the crash of Jeju Air Flight 2216. So we're going to go, in chronological order. We're going to start with the Azerbaijan Airlines crash, what we know so far about that crash, what the data can tell us, what the data can't tell us, and how we inferred some of the things about the flight path of that aircraft, as well as what we know about the investigation. And then we'll shift over to the Jeju Air flight and talk about what we know there, which unfortunately is dramatically less than what we know about the Azerbaijan Air flight. So let's start in Baku at 03:55 UTC on the 25th of December. When Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243 took off for Grozny, Russia. There is a lack of data for this flight that we will talk about in just a little bit, but we're going to walk through first what we know so far, and then we'll take it step by step there. So from 03:55 to 04:25 UTC, we have good ADS-B data with valid position reports as the aircraft tracks towards Grozny. This follows the same flight path that the flight has used in the past, and that aircraft traveling in that direction generally take. At 4:25 UTC, we lose ADS-B position data due to GPS interference in the region. This is not uncommon. This has unfortunately become far too common, and something we've talked about in previous episodes. But in this case, the GPS interference leaves us without position updates. However, we maintained reception of heading and speed data. So we were able to note that the aircraft traveled at the same heading that it was traveling at when we lost positional information for another 12 minutes. So at 04:37 UTC, we have a track of the aircraft up until then. Between 04:37 UTC and 05:13 UTC, we don't have position information that is in any way, shape, or form valid, nor do we receive any of the extended MODES data that would be helpful in determining possibly where the aircraft is. At a certain point during that period, at about 4:40 UTC, the aircraft was subject to GPS spoofing. And you can see that on the screen is a perfect circle. And that's often how we can denote where an aircraft is being spoofed to, because there are a couple of ways that GPS spoofing will manifest itself on Flight Radar 24, or if you're looking at a flight path from this aircraft or another aircraft. One of those ways is a perfect circle where the aircraft is just flying in a perfect circle when it shouldn't be. There are certain cases where you would have an aircraft flying in a perfect circle, like an ILS calibration or some type of instrument landing calibration where there's a flight check aircraft doing that. But a normal commercial aircraft isn't going to fly in a perfect circle. They're going to fly more in a racetrack pattern.
Especially not with such a tight circumference as was this flight. This
Is,
not something an E190 is likely capable of doing.
Correct. So that we can attribute to GPS spoofing. At 05:13 UTC, we once again receive heading and indicated airspeed data. And that goes all the way without position information. And that goes all the way up to 0607 UTC when we begin receiving the valid ADSB reporting in full again. And from there until the end of the flight at 0628 UTC, we receive full information. So let's talk about what we know from the ADSB data from 0607 to 0628, and then we'll back up and see what we can infer with a good bit of math and some 16th century sailing techniques before that. So looking at the 3D representation of the flight path that we were able to construct with the ADSB data and some altitude correction, we can see that the aircraft was oscillating between negative 8,000 and positive 8,000 feet per minute as it descended generally toward Aktau airport in Kazakhstan. So it flew across the Caspian Sea somehow and somehow made it to the Kazakhstan shore. They lined up for or tried to line up for one approach. That got called off as they neared the airport. They made a left-hand turn and then made basically a figure eight. So a left-hand turn and then a right-hand turn. And then as part of that right-hand turn, tore back toward the airport, the aircraft crashed just inward from the coast, killing all but 29 of the 62 people aboard. Those surviving were those in the tail section of the aircraft. So that is the end of the flight. And we can talk about what the aircraft was doing towards the end of the flight, which was flying likely on differential thrust alone, based on the fugue pattern and everything we've seen in the videos of the crash.
Pretty quickly after the crash had occurred, the initial images we saw focused on the tail section of the aircraft, since that was really the only recognizable part of the aircraft there was to see. And the entire tail section had the telltale signs of some sort of external impact to the aircraft, shrapnel damage. Something impacted the aircraft from the outside in. And it went very quickly from assuming, we don't know what happened, to quickly, very, very accurately predicting, this aircraft was definitely impacted by something on the exterior. And that is indeed what happened. The damage, at least as far as we could see, was pretty severe to the tail of the aircraft, where there are a lot of components that control the pitch of the aircraft, the altitude adjustment. That's where all of your fly-by-wire components for the elevator are going to be. And we don't know just yet, but until the black boxes, or the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder are hopefully read out in full to tell us what happened to that aircraft during the flight. As we know, all of the critical components, they're hydraulically actuated, so you're going to need hydraulic pressure, and if that runs out, you're going to have to, as Ian said, fly that aircraft using differential thrust. Which, if you're showing the 3D flight path,
I can put that back up.
Yeah, it's a dramatic, extremely dramatic, let's call it, approach into Kazakhstan. There were a number of times, and Ian, I think we can talk next about the adjusted altitude. There were a number of times where that aircraft very nearly impacted the sea, but thankfully was recovered, and they were able to get, for better or worse, just barely on shore. You can see the first attempt they made to land on the rather small single runway airport. They were almost damn near lined up with that runway, but it looks like for whatever reason, they decided it was, or maybe they didn't decide, maybe it's just what the aircraft actually ended up doing under its conditions. They made that left turn and tried to circle around almost kind of in a figure eight pattern to realign with the runway, but unfortunately that didn't happen, because likely the aircraft at that point was just too crippled with too many failed or degraded systems, which the initial and final report will reveal just how crippled the aircraft was. But it is important at this point to point out the I would call it absolutely heroic actions of the flight crew to get the aircraft that far in that condition, and be able to not just line the aircraft up with the runway, but presumably they they were on the right path, and on a severely crippled aircraft with almost certainly flying under differential thrust. It's a testament to their flight training, their capability of flying the aircraft, and the E190 itself. It's kind of amazing to see the amount of damage to that aircraft after the, I'm not going to call it the crash landing. It's a crash, and know that dozens of people did survive that crash. It is absolutely amazing. But Ian, why don't you tell us a little bit about the adjusted altitude?
Yeah, so you can see on the screen in the 3D flight path that we have up, it's noted that the altitude is corrected for the QNH. So ADS-B data is reported in standard pressure, so 1013.25 hectopascals. And that's standard atmospheric pressure. But local pressure can change how barometric altitude is reported. So we've corrected the altitude data for this particular flight because it's important in that the QNH adjustment would, if without the adjustment, it would put the aircraft in negative values. So if you've taken a look at the ADS-B data that we published, that has, in the granular data, that has negative altitude values that, when corrected for the local pressure, then become positive altitude values and still very low. You can see that, the colorization here in the image, red is near ground level, and the line turns red multiple times before the aircraft actually gets on the ground. And so there were multiple times, at least 4, maybe 5 times, where the aircraft came extremely close to crashing in a even less controlled manner than it did, where things could have been even worse. So I think that's an important note, as Jason brings up. Let's back up now and talk about what we've been able to infer about where the aircraft was coming from, because there were initial reports of where the aircraft was, what it did, and why it did it. The data that we received from the aircraft from 513 to 0607 did not include positional updates, as I said before, but it did include the heading of the aircraft and the indicated airspeed. So working back from the known position at 0607, we were able to use basically reverse dead reckoning to estimate the possible flight path of the aircraft between 513 and 607. And that flight path takes us, and you can see on the screen, is the cyan line. That takes us back to about Grozny Airport, so south of Grozny Airport. So what we understand at this point is that there were multiple approaches at Grozny. The METAR reports low visibility, so that makes perfect sense. The aircraft was attempting to land, and the weather was below minimums for landing, so the aircraft conducted go-arounds. At that point, what exactly happened will have to be borne out in either a preliminary or a final report. But we do know that the aircraft was coming from somewhere in Russia, south of Grozny. So that was a helpful piece, I think, to put together in this puzzle to understand where this aircraft was coming from. We received the first Squawk 7700 at 5:25 UTC, so right around Grozny Airport, and that makes sense given the reported incidents of what the transcripts of the ATC that we've seen published, though how official those are certainly are up for question. But the timeline does indeed make sense.
Yeah. So what we do know is that the area was involved in conflict at the time. There were Ukrainian drones coming into the region, and the Russian whomever the Russian defense network would have been shooting down drones at the time. That we know that is unfortunately a very common thing at this point. This seems like a case of very unfortunate timing and misidentification of this aircraft for a drone. Um, Exceptionally different circumstances from the last time this happened, also involving Ukraine and Russia with the Malaysia Airlines 777. Unfortunately, that aircraft was shot down at cruising altitude at 30 plus thousand feet, whereas this aircraft was at a approach altitude of some sort. We don't know at what altitude the aircraft was
Right.
targeted, and if they could even see the aircraft, I think is actually another question that we do not have the answer
Unlikely
to.
based on the METOR,
Unlikely.
but we'll be able to hopefully learn more in the,
Yeah.
in the final report.
So whomever it was on the ground was likely utilizing just whatever radar capabilities their defense system had, and because of the GPS jamming and spoofing, they likely didn't even have a way to confirm what the defense system was telling them. Was this a drone? Was this something else? Was this one of our own aircraft? There are so many questions that we just don't have the answer to, and honestly, I don't think we ever will have the answer to a lot of these questions, because let's be honest, Russia initially at first said, "Oh, this aircraft had a bird strike." No, there was no bird strike. It was shot down.
Quite the
take,
bird.
yeah, take quite the bird. Take everything you hear out of the Russian authorities, at least with a large grain of salt. But thankfully, we know who will be investigating this thoroughly at this point. Ian, why don't you tell us a little about the collation of investigations here?
Sure. So what we know so far is that Kazakhstan is going to lead the investigation as the site of incident, which is generally how it works. There are the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder have both been recovered. Those are being sent to Brazil for readout by the Brazilian accident investigation team there. Because this is an Embraer aircraft, Brazil is party to the investigation under ICAO Annex 13 as the state of manufacture. So this generally tracks with the possible places that the black boxes could be sent for readout and initial analysis. And then obviously Azerbaijan will be a party to the investigation as well. And it sounds like Russia will be somewhat party to the investigation, though Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan both rejected pretty quickly Russia's offer to lead the investigation.
A wise decision,
So that
I would say.
that will not be happening.
Yeah. So really, really unfortunate that in modern times something like this can happen again for the second time in a decade span. It's really an unthinkable thing that this could happen with all of the technology at our disposal. This could happen again. This flight from Baku to Grozny actually was suspended for quite a few months. There were no flights between September 11th, the last time it operated, and December 15th, where possibly the aircraft diverted back to Baku. Can't really be quite sure, because the last ADSB information we have has it heading back towards Baku before the GPS jamming and spoofing kicks in. But it only operated every few days from December 15th, and this would have been the fifth flight of resumption of services to Grozny before the fatal flight, unfortunately. Since then, Azerbaijan Airlines has suspended service to, I think, 8 different Russian cities in the region. First, there were a couple that were in the immediate area, including at Grozny, and then that was included to additional cities, even including Sochi, which is a pretty major city. So I don't imagine those routes will be resuming anytime soon. Azerbaijan Airlines just on December 28th, 2024, so a couple days after the incident, suspended those routes, but has no information about when. Actually, it clarified to say the suspension will be in effect until the completion of the final investigation. So that could potentially be many years with those routes suspended if that holds true. So that's an interesting piece of information.
Yeah, so that's where we are now. We'll leave it there in Kazakhstan, and we'll shift over to Muan, South Korea, which this accident, if the Azerbaijan Airlines crash raises a host of questions, I I don't even know what the numbering
What you can say
noun
here,
is
yeah, this
for
is
this particular
w-
occurrence.
Ian, we've been doing this for a while now, and other people have been doing this for a lot longer than
Yeah,
us. And I cannot recall a crash where so many seasoned people in this field look at what just has happened and just scratches their head and says, I can't make heads or tails of anything I just saw.
no.
Nothing I've seen makes any sense. That's this crash.
Yes, that is an accurate description of what has happened. So let's talk about what we know, and then let's talk about what we don't know, and
Which is
go
still
from
a
there,
lot.
which is still a lot. So this was flight 2216 by Jeju Air from Bangkok to Muan, and the aircraft departed on time, and flew for 4.5 hours and made it to near the runway before we lost ADS-B data. But about the time we lost ADS-B data, we end up with an accumulation of visual evidence to understand the crash itself. But the accumulation of visual evidence of the crash itself raises any number of questions. So the flight was coming in from the south. Muan has a single north-south runway, runway 01, which is the runway that you land on from the south, and runway 19, which is the one you land on from the north. We know that the aircraft approached from the south from Bangkok and was on approach when it was warned by the air traffic controller of birds in the area, which is not uncommon at this airport. This airport is very well known for large flocks of birds. It's in a coastal area right on the water, in an area that's perfect bird habitat, I guess is a good way to say it. Uh, and then, not long after they were warned that there were birds in the area, the pilots reported a bird strike, or what they believed to be a bird strike.
Yeah, and it wasn't long because Reuters put together a timeline so far of
Mm-hmm.
what has happened. And between the time the aircraft or the flight crew was cleared to land and warned about birds was 8:57 a.m. Air traffic control gives caution bird activity advisory. Just 2 minutes later, 8:59, the pilots apparently reported Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. So they made a Mayday call, continuing bird strike, go around, which is interesting because I don't know if we know if that last bit where they say go around was something that they meant to communicate to air traffic control, or if that was
Right.
something they meant to be telling each other and they accidentally keyed the radio,
The
which is
the mic was
possible.
still warm. Yeah.
Yeah, if the mic was still hot. But either way, um, this happened very quickly between being warned about birds and a Mayday call being issued. From there, Ian, tell us a bit what happened in
Yeah,
that sort of
so
timeline.
we do know that they were in the process of conducting a go. The ADS-B data cuts out when the aircraft is at 500 feet, but they're stabilizing at 500 feet. The vertical rate has been arrested, and they're stabilizing at 500 feet. We know that. What we also know is that right after the ADS-B cuts out, we begin getting video from the ground of the aircraft, because at that time the aircraft is making noises that aircraft don't normally make when they fly over. So people are looking up in the air and they're starting to point their camera phones up into the air. So there is a video of the aircraft experiencing what at this point looks like successive compressor stalls, from shot from a hotel balcony that is just south of the airport complex, and in line with the runway. So the aircraft flies directly over this person taking the video. The aircraft flies over that, seemingly experiencing compressor stalls in the right engine. They make a sharp turn to line up, instead of with runway 1 from the south, to come back around and make an approach from runway 19 coming from the north. So at 9:01, the plane approached the south, the runway 01 from the south. At 9:02, the aircraft is on the ground, having landed nearly 2/3 of the way down the runway on runway 19. So in about a minute, they turned around and touched down on the runway. Here's where it continues to get more unexplainable. In the initial video taken by the hotel person staying at the hotel on their balcony, the gear is not down. The flaps are not down on the aircraft. When the aircraft touches down on the runway, the flaps are not down and the gear is not down on the aircraft. The aircraft touches down about a little more than halfway down, between halfway and 2/3 down the runway, makes contact without the landing gear lowered, and slides at a high rate of speed off the runway, impacting the localizer, which at this particular airport, and we continue to get even more unexplainable, at this particular airport, has been set in a mass of concrete surrounded by an earthen berm.
Yeah. Initially, when we saw the video, everyone came to the quick assumption that the aircraft had impacted the perimeter wall of the airport, which is not something all that uncommon at any major airport. It keeps people out of the airport, keeps wildlife out of the airport, and keeps things that are supposed to be inside the airport inside the airport. This looks, if you look at Google Street View, just looks like a cinder block wall, not that huge of a structure. Not something you want to hit with an aircraft, but might fare okay.
The perimeter wall, you mean?
The perimeter
like
wall, yeah.
Right,
The the localizer antenna structure. Man, every time we see pictures of this thing, it is unfathomably. I don't even have the words to describe what a bad idea this was, which apparently, according to South Korean investigators or government officials at this point, is not unique to this particular airport. It exists outside of this airport at other airports in South Korea, which is troubling because this is not an old airport that has been retrofitted to modern standards. This airport only opened, I think, in 2007 and is currently undergoing a runway lengthening project. But what essentially the concrete structure did here is prop up the localizer structure so that the antennas are actually on the same at the same altitude or the same level as the runway surface. And to do
there's a reason for it.
There's a good reason for it. However, embedding the structure in a concrete structure with an earthen mound around it, basically, it is not what you want to do, because the standards for this kind of thing is that if and when an aircraft strikes the antennas, they are supposed to break away. And these things do happen. It's happened many times. That's why the regulations exists, where if an aircraft hits these antennas, they're supposed to be on frangible supports, and they are supposed to break away. What's not supposed to happen is those antennas be raised up from the surface around it in a concrete block that, unfortunately, as we saw here in this crash, absolutely obliterated the aircraft and the hope of really almost anyone surviving this accident. It is unthinkably poor design.
Yeah, there were 181 people on board. 2 survived. The only 2 people to survive were at the very rear of the aircraft. And those were 2 flight attendants who were seated in the rear galley jump seats.
So if you see the images of the aircraft, which you probably have on screen now, it's again, the only recognizable part of the aircraft is aft of the rear exit doors. There's no chance anyone else on that aircraft is surviving. So those flight attendants, thankfully, were in the right place on that aircraft. But it is just it's a head scratcher, everything about this. And let's back up a minute um, to when the video first started. So what we saw was the ADS-B data, it kicked out for reasons. That could be because one of the engines failed, and that supplies electrical power to the systems that relay the ADS-B data. Some other failure. We
We
don't
don't
know.
know at
We,
this
we
point,
don't have
right?
those answers. What we do know is that is around the time when the video started, because compressor stalls, if you've ever heard them or been around them, they are loud. They are frighteningly loud. It's bam, 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 over and over until the engine shuts itself off or fails or is shut off by the flight crew. We don't really know why that happened. A bird strike is likely, very possible. Given the circumstances, that is likely what happened, but we've often heard of reports of bird strikes or drone strikes, and when the investigation looks into it, it was actually something else entirely. We don't have
Right.
that facts. It's not really relevant. It's not important. What we know is that something happened to that aircraft, like just to my tissue box over to the right. Sorry. Thank you, Kat. Something happened, but even when that happened, that aircraft was in no way configured to land, like you said, without the landing gear, without the flaps or the slats. It doesn't make sense that that aircraft was in that configuration at that point. What makes this even more confusing is the rush of the flight crew to essentially make a 180 U-turn over the airport and force the aircraft to land at a very high rate of speed with still no landing gear, no flaps, nothing. This aircraft was not in any sort of approach or forget about landing configuration, but it
Yeah.
seemed to be traveling at such a high rate of speed that why, I think this is going to be the biggest question, is why did the flight crew force a landing so quickly? I mean, from what was it, 901 to 902 to complete
Yeah.
an 180-degree turn over the airfield. That's an insanely quick period of time, especially if this aircraft was producing thrust still. We don't know. That's something the investigation will have to look into. But interestingly, this came out, I think, a day or two ago from John Ostrower, put out an article saying that the NTSB, I think, investigation team headed to South Korea does not include any power plant experts or propulsion experts, leading us to believe that, well, I guess you have to draw your own conclusions because we just don't know that. Why wouldn't they be looking into engine issues? I don't know. What's your take on that?
And the NTSB has said that propulsion experts are part of the investigation.
But they're not
They're just not
traveling.
traveling to South Korea.
Which,
So the NTSB is leading a investigative delegation, again, as part of ICAO Annex 13, as the state of manufacturer of this Boeing 737-800. They are leading experts from the NTSB, from Boeing, and I believe from CFM, but the engine experts and the NTSB propulsion experts aren't traveling to the scene. I don't know what to make of that.
no, it's very hard
Either
to follow that
I mean,
logic.
either the engines sent the data back to CFM, because that is entirely possible. The
Yeah,
engines were
absolutely.
sending data back to CFM, and they have all the data they need to make a determination, or it's just not something that they feel they need to travel to the scene for. Those particular specialists, I don't know, but it will be interesting to see how propulsion factors into the events surrounding this crash, and how that factors into the final report. Um, Hopefully, we'll have a preliminary report soon, within the month, I believe,
Yes.
is generally the target goal for that. The NTSB, I believe, is also going to do the readout for the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. The flight data recorder was reported by the Korean government. I think it was the Korean regional government for the area, said that the flight data recorder had been damaged. We don't know how damaged, but from our conversations in the past with folks at the NTSB, including Sean Payne, who works in the recording lab, you can damage those things pretty severely and the NTSB will do a fantastic job to get as much data as they possibly can.
Yeah, and thankfully, as we saw, the flight data recorders are kept in the tail section of the aircraft, which fared thankfully the best, since that was obviously the last section to experience the impact. So hopefully, those are able to be read out. And I think this is one of those cases where the flight data recorder might not tell us a whole lot, but the cockpit voice recorder is going to be, let's say, illuminating, because we have no idea what was happening in the flight deck of that aircraft, and there have got to be some answers on that recording, because this is even day. Usually what happens after an incident like this is 24, 48, 72 hours goes by, and we get a much better picture of what happened. Some critical piece of information will come out. We'll have a better idea. We won't know exactly what happened. And we won't want to jump to conclusions, but we'll have a much better idea of, here's what happened. We don't know exactly why it happened, but here's some more helpful data. This time around, we don't have any of that. We just have, every time a story comes out, there is more and more and more head scratching and questions and unexplained phenomenon, really. Like I just, it's so hard to look at this and explain to my friends or family who ask what happened in that plane, and just, I don't know.
We don't know. We just don't know.
No explanation whatsoever, because nothing we have seen makes any sense whatsoever. So hopefully the South Korean authorities and whomever, I guess the NTSB is reading out those boxes, are able to get not just usable data, but some solid answers. Or maybe there's just pieces we don't know. What happened before the video started? What happened in the time where the aircraft was turning around in the air? Because I don't think we actually have that piece of video.
We have a few videos of the aircraft making the turn.
Okay.
But they don't, I mean, they haven't, at least to my eye, they have not been revealing in any way, shape, or form.
One piece of information that I think we skimmed over this time around was, even if the aircraft is stricken and hydraulic systems are lost and engines are failing, the 737 and all modern aircraft have the ability to lower their landing gear using nothing but gravity on board. So even if there was a bird strike and both engines failed and there's no electrical power, no hydraulic power, and they're flying just on brute force alone, that crew should have been able to basically pull a cord and have the landing gear drop using gravity and hopefully lock into place. But again, looking at all the video, if they tried that, it either didn't work or they didn't get to that step for whatever reason. Perhaps the flight deck was overwhelmed with smoke after the whatever happened to the engines. We've talked about this on other episodes recently, where things can happen to the engine, and using the bleed air system that can rapidly fill up the cabin and the flight deck with smoke, and that could have been very overwhelming for the flight crew on board, who got disoriented and missed very crucial steps. In this case, we don't know, but what we do know is that even without any power, that aircraft should have been able to, at minimum, lower the landing gear or attempt to lower the landing gear. And in this case, it didn't even look like the landing gear was partially extended. It didn't look like it was at any point.
We didn't see any doors in the front. Obviously, the 737 doesn't have main gear doors, but no front door was open or anything like that. So certainly one of the major questions that will hopefully be answered by the flight data recorder and the cockpit.
2024 is behind us, but it started off really poorly. We had two major incidents to start 2024 right in a row. We had the JAL A350 impact with the Japanese Coast Guard dash at Haneda. And just a few days later, we had the
Alaska Air door
plug blowout,
mid-cabin plug
out of Portland. So we had two major incidents to start 2024, and unfortunately, it ended no better than it started. But we felt like this was two major incidents enough that we needed to discuss it off our normal schedule. And hopefully by the time this comes out, we'll have some more answers, but
probably not quite yet. So we'll leave the conversation there. We'll be back on the 10th of January with a normal episode. And until then, hopefully 2025 gets off to a much better start than 2024 either began or ended. This has been episode 301, a very special video episode of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnik here, as always, with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.